Boone Slater had searched for 3 months to find a bride who knew nothing. He needed someone untouched, not by morality, but by the kind of knowledge that ruins men. The arrangement was simple, the terms clear, the expectations unspoken. Calla arrived on the afternoon stage with a single worn bag and eyes that looked too long at things most people ignored. The ceremony lasted 8 minutes. No one kissed. No one smiled. When they walked to his isolated homestead as husband and wife, he noticed her hands, delicate but marked with stains he could not identify, dark traces under her fingernails that did not come from soil. That night, when he lay on his bed without a shirt, believing he understood what innocence looked like, Calla appeared in a nightgown that contradicted everything he assumed about her. She carried a bundle of herbs he had never seen, moved with a confidence that made his breath catch, and when she began to speak about the scars on his hands, about the wounds he thought he had hidden, about the real reason he wanted a bride who knew nothing, Boone Slater froze, because the woman he married to protect himself from knowledge was about to teach him the one truth he had spent years trying to escape, and there was no door left to close. The church stood at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to emptiness. Boone arrived alone, his horse tied outside, his coat buttoned despite the heat. He had worn his cleanest shirt, not for ceremony, but because the arrangement demanded a certain appearance of respectability. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and dust that had settled into every corner over decades. 3 witnesses sat scattered in the pews, people he barely knew, required by law, but not by choice. The preacher waited at the altar with a worn Bible and an expression that asked no questions. This was the 4th such ceremony he had performed that year. Arrangements made through letters and desperation, unions built on need rather than feeling. Calla entered without music. Her dress was simple, gray fabric that had been mended more than once, the color of smoke or distant storms. She walked alone down the short aisle, her steps neither hesitant nor eager, simply measured. Boone turned to watch her approach and found himself studying details he had not expected to notice. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that was younger than her letter suggested, but carried something in the eyes that aged her beyond years. Her hands held no flowers, no Bible, nothing except themselves, and he noticed immediately the dark stains beneath her fingernails, residue that looked like crushed plants, or perhaps something else entirely. She reached the altar and stood beside him without looking up. The preacher began speaking words that Boone had heard before at other weddings, words about joining and commitment and duties that felt hollow in this particular room with these particular people. He glanced sideways at Calla and saw her lips moving slightly, not in prayer, but as if she were counting something, measuring time or breaths or distance to the door. When the preacher asked if he took this woman, Boone said yes without hesitation, because hesitation implied doubt, and doubt implied feeling, and he had specifically arranged this marriage to avoid both. When Calla was asked the same question, she paused for exactly 3 seconds before answering, and in that pause Boone felt something shift in the air between them, some recognition that this was a transaction neither of them had entered lightly. They signed the papers on a small table near the door. Calla's handwriting was precise, educated, unexpected. The witnesses signed as well, their names meaningless, their faces already forgettable. The preacher collected his fee and wished them well with the tone of a man who had learned not to invest hope in arranged marriages. Outside, Boone untied his horse and turned to find Calla already walking toward the edge of town, her single bag in hand, moving in the direction of his ranch as if she had always known the way. He led the horse alongside her, neither offering to let her ride nor explaining why. They walked in silence through the empty streets, past buildings that watched with windows like dead eyes, past people who stared without greeting. The town fell behind them, and the land opened into vastness. Boone's ranch sat 2 miles from the last building, a deliberate distance he had chosen when he first claimed the property. Isolation was not loneliness if you built it intentionally. The house came into view, larger than necessary for one person, surrounded by corrals and sheds and equipment that spoke of work without companionship. Calla stopped walking and looked at it for a long moment. Boone watched her face for reaction, but found none. Only that same measuring expression, as if she were calculating something he could not name. When she finally moved again, it was toward the house without waiting for invitation, and Boone followed his new wife across the threshold into a marriage that had been signed, but not yet tested. Inside the house, the air was cooler but no more welcoming. Boone had cleaned before her arrival, removing dust and arranging things with the precision of a man who lived by routine. The main room held a table, chairs, a stove that radiated yesterday's heat. Calla set her bag down near the door and walked slowly through the space, her fingers trailing along surfaces, touching the back of a chair, the edge of the table, the windowsill that overlooked empty land. She moved like someone reading a room the way others read books, gathering information from objects and arrangement, and the things that were missing. Boone stood near the stove and watched her, uncertain what was expected now that the ceremony had ended and the contract had begun. He had imagined this moment during the 3 months of searching and letter writing, but in his imagination the woman had been passive, grateful, silent. Calla was none of these things. She opened cupboards without asking permission, examining his supplies of flour and coffee and dried meat with an expression that suggested judgment. When she found his collection of whiskey bottles lined beneath the counter, she paused, counting them silently before closing the door without comment. He cleared his throat, a sound that felt too loud in the quiet house. She turned to face him for the first time since they had entered, and he noticed her eyes were darker than he had realized, almost black in the dimness of the room. She did not smile. Neither did he. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled too tight, and Boone found himself speaking just to break it. "Your room is upstairs. First door. I have not been in it." Calla tilted her head slightly, studying him with that same measuring look. "Why would you go in it?" He had no answer that made sense. The room had been prepared for someone, but he had not truly believed that someone would arrive, would be real, would stand in his house asking questions he had not prepared to answer. He gestured vaguely toward the stairs, and she nodded once before climbing them, her steps light but deliberate. He listened to her moving above him, heard the sound of her bag being set down, a window being opened, floorboards creaking under her weight. When she came back down, the sun had shifted lower, and the room had darkened into shadows. She moved to the stove without asking and began preparing food from his supplies, her movements efficient and practiced. She worked without speaking, and Boone sat at the table watching her hands as they cut and stirred and arranged. Those same hands with the dark stains beneath the nails, hands that moved with a confidence that did not match the story of a desperate woman accepting an arranged marriage from a stranger. He wanted to ask where she had learned to move like that, what those stains were, why her letters had sounded nothing like the woman now standing in his kitchen. But the questions felt dangerous, like opening doors that should remain closed. They ate in silence. The food was better than anything he had made in months. When the plates were empty, Calla stood and carried them to the basin, washing them with water from the pump while Boone remained at the table, paralyzed by the strangeness of having another person in his space. Darkness had fully settled outside now, turning the windows into black mirrors. The day was ending. The night was beginning. And Boone realized with a cold feeling in his chest that he had no idea what happened next. No script for this particular arrangement, no way to maintain the distance he had built this entire marriage to preserve. Calla dried her hands on a cloth and turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. Then she spoke words that made his breathing stop. "It is time for bed. We should go upstairs now." Boone climbed the stairs behind her, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway at the top was narrow, lit only by the lamp Calla carried, shadows jumping against the walls with every movement. She stopped at the first door, the one he had told her was hers, and turned the handle. The room inside was simple. A bed with clean sheets, a dresser, a window that faced east toward nothing. She set the lamp on the dresser and looked at the space with that same evaluating expression she had used on everything else in his house. "This is where I sleep?" Boone nodded from the doorway, keeping distance between them. "That is correct." Calla walked to the window and looked out into darkness. "And where do you sleep?" "Down the hall. Last door." She turned to face him, and in the lamplight her features seemed sharper, more defined. The shadows carved lines under her cheekbones, made her eyes deeper. She studied him with an intensity that made him want to look away. But he forced himself to hold her gaze because looking away meant weakness, and he could not afford weakness now. That is not how marriage works. Her voice was calm, stating fact rather than making argument. Boone felt his jaw tighten. The arrangement was clear. You have your space. I have mine. Calla moved away from the window, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. She stopped close enough that he could smell something on her skin. An herbal scent he could not identify, something green and sharp. Her head tilted back to look up at him, and he realized she was smaller than he had noticed before. her frame delicate despite the strength and how she carried herself. The arrangement was clear about many things, but you left other things unsaid. Why is that? Boone felt heat rising in his chest, anger or fear or something he could not name. I do not owe you explanations on our first night. She smiled then, but it was not a pleasant expression. It was knowing, sad, almost pitying. You are right. You owe me nothing. But I see your hands, Boone Slater. I saw them at the altar. I saw them at dinner. Those scars are not from ranch work. Those are from something else. Something you do to yourself when the nights get too long and the whiskey stops working. His breath caught. How would you know anything about that? Calla reached out, and before he could stop her, she took his right hand in both of hers, turning it palm up to expose the network of old scars across his knuckles, the places where skin had been broken and healed badly over and over. Her fingers traced the lines gently, a touch that should have felt intrusive but somehow did not. Because I took care of my father for 2 years while he died slowly, I learned to recognize pain in all its forms. The kind that comes from outside and the kind that comes from inside. And yours, husband, comes from inside. He pulled his hand away, stepping back into the hallway. This conversation is finished. No, it is not. Because you brought me here for a reason, and that reason was not companionship or children or help with the ranch. You brought me here because you thought innocence could protect you from something. But I am not what you think I am, and tonight you will understand that. She moved past him into the hallway, walking toward his room without invitation. Boone stood frozen, his heart pounding against his ribs. He should stop her. He should establish boundaries. He should maintain the distance this entire arrangement was built on. But his feet would not move. His voice would not come. He could only watch as Calla pushed open the door to his room and stepped inside, disappearing into the darkness beyond. When he finally followed, she was lighting the lamp beside his bed, the flame casting warm light across the space he had occupied alone for 5 years. His room was larger than hers, the bed wider, the furniture heavier. She moved to his dresser and opened the top drawer without hesitation, finding the bundle of dried plants he kept there, herbs he had tried using for sleep but never understood properly. She held them up, examining them in the light. These are wrong. They will make it worse, not better. Boone closed the door behind him, feeling trapped in his own space. What are you doing? Calla set the useless herbs aside and reached into the pocket of her dress. Pulling out a small cloth bundle he had not noticed her carrying, she unwrapped it carefully, revealing fresh plants he did not recognize, their leaves still green despite being cut, their smell filling the room with something that made his head feel clearer and foggier at the same time. I am going to help you, but first, you need to remove your shirt and lie down. Boone stood beside his own bed feeling like an intruder. His hands moved to the buttons of his shirt slowly, uncertainty making his fingers clumsy. Calla turned away, not from modesty but to prepare whatever mixture she intended to use, grinding the herbs between her palms over a small bowl she had found on his washstand. The sound of her movements filled the silence while he undressed, removing his shirt and folding it with unnecessary precision, delaying what came next. When he finally lay down on top of the covers, his bare chest exposed to the cool air, he felt more vulnerable than he had in years, maybe ever. Calla turned back and he saw her clearly for the first time in lamplight. She had removed her outer dress while his back was turned, standing now in only a thin nightgown that clung to her frame in ways the gray dress had hidden. The fabric was worn in places, nearly transparent where the lamp behind her created silhouettes he had not prepared to see. She moved toward the bed carrying the bowl of crushed herbs, her feet bare against the wooden floor, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. Everything about this moment contradicted the image of innocence he had built in his mind during 3 months of searching. She sat on the edge of the bed, and his body tensed involuntarily. Her weight shifted the mattress, bringing her closer, and he could smell the herbs mixed with something else, the scent of her skin, warm and alive. She dipped her fingers into the bowl and held them up, showing him the green paste that coated them. This will burn slightly, but it will help. Boone found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. Help with what? With the pain you carry in your hands, in your chest, in the parts of yourself you damage when you think no one is watching. Before he could respond, she pressed her palm against his chest, directly over his heart, and he froze completely. The herbs were cold at first, then warming, then burning in a way that felt like it reached deeper than skin. Her hand stayed in place, firm and steady, while his breathing stopped entirely. She looked down at him with those dark eyes, and spoke in a voice that was neither gentle nor harsh. Simply honest. You wanted a bride who knew nothing because you are afraid of being known. Someone hurt you badly enough that you believe knowledge itself is dangerous, that if a woman understands you, she will use that understanding as a weapon. So you searched for ignorance, for someone who could share your house but never your truth. His jaw clenched. You know nothing about me. Calla's other hand moved to his right arm, spreading more of the mixture along the scars on his knuckles. I know you hit things until your hands break. I know you drink until you cannot feel. I know you built this house too large and filled it with nothing because emptiness feels safer than companionship. I know you sleep with your door unlocked because part of you hopes someone will come in and find you, but you also hope they never do. Stop. The word came out weak, not commanding. She did not stop. Her hands moved across his skin, tracing patterns with the herbs, following the lines of old injuries he had thought were invisible. Every touch felt like exposure, like being read by someone who understood a language he did not know he was writing. I took care of my father for 2 years while he destroyed himself from inside. He drank to forget what he had done in the war. He hurt himself to feel something other than guilt. I learned to recognize self-destruction in all its forms. Husband, and you are drowning in it. Boone tried to sit up, but her hand pressed firmly against his chest, holding him down with surprising strength. His muscles could have overpowered her easily, but he found himself unable to move. Paralyzed not by her force but by the truth in her words. You wanted innocence because you thought it would be passive. You thought I would ask no questions, make no demands, see no deeper than the surface you present. But I am not innocent, Boone Slater. I am educated. I am observant, and I spent 2 years learning to heal people who do not want to be healed. Her fingers traced a scar near his shoulder, one he had gotten from deliberately gripping barbed wire until it cut deep. How did you know about that one? He had never told anyone. Because men who hurt themselves follow patterns. Because pain has a language if you learn to read it. Because the moment I walked into this house, I saw a man hiding from something so terrible he would rather marry a stranger than face it alone. The herbs on his skin burned hotter now, pulling blood to the surface, making every nerve feel raw. Calla leaned closer, her face inches from his, her breath warm against his cooling skin. The nightgown shifted with her movement and he forced himself to keep his eyes on hers, though his body responded to her proximity in ways that terrified him more than her words. So tell me, husband, what are you so afraid of? What happened that made you believe knowledge was your enemy? And in that moment, lying bare beneath her knowing gaze, Boone Slater realized the woman he had married to protect himself from truth was about to tear apart every defense he had spent 5 years building. The words hung in the air between them, a question that demanded answer but offered no safety in the telling. Boone stared up at the ceiling, feeling the weight of Calla's hand still pressed against his chest, the burn of the herbs spreading through his skin like truth he could no longer contain. His throat felt tight, his eyes burned, and for the first time in 5 years, he spoke about the thing he had buried so deep he sometimes convinced himself it never happened. Her name was Margaret. We were engaged for 2 years. She was the daughter of a banker in town, educated, beautiful, everything a man was supposed to want. Calla said nothing, her hand remaining steady against his heart, listening in a way that felt different from how people usually listened. She was not waiting to speak. She was absorbing every word like medicine she needed to measure precisely. 3 weeks before the wedding, I came home early from working the ranch, found her in my bed with the foreman I had hired that spring, a man I trusted, a man I paid. They were not hiding. They did not hear me come in. I stood in that doorway and watched them together, and something broke inside me that has never healed. His voice cracked on the last word and he hated himself for it. Calla's fingers spread wider against his chest, covering more surface, as if she could hold the broken pieces together through pressure alone. What did you do? Nothing. I walked away. I called off the wedding. I fired the foreman. I sold everything I owned and bought this land as far from town as possible, and I told myself that if a woman could learn to deceive that well, if she could smile at me every day while planning to betray me, then knowledge itself was the weapon. That ignorance would be protection. Calla shifted her weight, leaning closer until her face was directly above his, her dark hair falling around them like a curtain that blocked out everything except this moment, this truth, this exposure he had never intended to allow. So you decided to marry someone who knew nothing about life, nothing about men, nothing about herself. Someone who would be grateful enough to obey and innocent enough never to want more than you offered. Someone who could not hurt you, because she would not know how. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Her eyes searched his face, and he saw something in them that looked like understanding mixed with sorrow, not for herself, but for him, for the prison he had built, and locked himself inside. But you were wrong about what innocence means. You thought it meant ignorance, passivity, safety. You thought if a woman had never known a man before you, she could never compare you to anyone else. Never find you lacking, never choose someone better. But innocence is not ignorance, Boone, and virginity is not stupidity. She moved her hand from his chest to his face, cupping his jaw with fingers that still smelled of crushed herbs and earth. Her thumb traced the line of his cheekbone, and he found himself unable to look away, unable to retreat behind the walls he had maintained through sheer will for so long. I came to you untouched by men because I chose that. Not from lack of opportunity, but from observation. I watched my father destroy himself over my mother's death. I saw how love turned to obsession, how grief became self-punishment. I learned that giving yourself to another person is the most dangerous thing you can do. So I kept myself separate, safe, alone. Her words mirrored his own fears so perfectly that he felt something shift between them, some recognition that they were both running from the same thing, wearing different faces. But you cannot live your whole life protecting yourself from pain. You cannot marry to avoid connection. You cannot seek ignorance as armor, because eventually the loneliness becomes worse than the risk of being hurt. Boone felt his chest constricting, his breathing becoming shallow. The herbs on his skin burned hotter, and he did not know if it was the plants or her proximity or the truth she was forcing him to confront. Her face was so close now that he could see flecks of lighter color in her dark eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath against his lips, could smell the herbs mixed with something uniquely her. Why did you really accept this arrangement? Calla? Her expression changed, something vulnerable flickering across her features before she controlled it. Because my father left nothing but debts when he died. Because the men in town looked at me like I was property to be claimed. Because you offered distance, and distance felt like safety. And now I'm lying in bed with a man I married this morning, touching his bare skin, speaking truths neither of us intended to share. Now I am realizing that safety is another kind of prison. And now I understand that you and I are more alike than either of us wanted to admit. The silence that followed was different from the silences before. This one felt less like distance and more like understanding. Two people standing on opposite sides of the same wound. Calla's hand remained against his face, her touch neither possessive nor uncertain, simply present. Boone found himself leaning into it slightly, a movement so small he almost convinced himself it did not happen, but she noticed. She noticed everything. You damage your hands when the memories become too strong. When do they become too strong? At night. Always at night. When the house is quiet and there is nothing left to distract me from thinking. She nodded as if this made perfect sense, as if self-destruction followed logical patterns she had studied. Her fingers moved from his face to his right hand again, lifting it between them, examining the knuckles in the lamplight. The scars were ugly, poorly healed. Evidence of repeated trauma he had inflicted without care for consequences. This one is recent. Within the last week. He did not ask how she knew. 5 nights ago. Could not sleep. Went to the barn and hit the support beam until the pain made everything else stop. Calla brought his hand closer to her face, studying it with the intensity of someone reading text in a difficult language. Then she did something he did not expect. She pressed her lips against the worst of the scars. Not a kiss exactly, but an acknowledgement, a witness to his pain that felt more intimate than anything they had shared yet. His breath caught, and she looked up at him through her lashes, her mouth still against his damaged skin. Pain is not the enemy. Boone, fear is. You hurt yourself because you are afraid of hurting someone else, afraid of wanting something you might lose, afraid of the moment when control slips and you become vulnerable to another person's choices. How can you possibly know that? Because I did the same thing. Different method, same reason. She released his hand and turned slightly, pushing up the sleeve of her nightgown to reveal her left forearm. In the lamplight he could see thin white lines, old scars running parallel along her inner wrist. Not deep enough to be fatal, but deliberate enough to be intentional. His chest tightened seeing them, understanding flooding through him. After my father died, I had nothing. No money, no family, no prospects except men who wanted to own me. I felt so trapped that I thought the only way out was to make myself unmarriageable, damaged. If I could not control my circumstances, I could at least control my own body. But you stopped. She pulled the sleeve back down, covering the evidence. I stopped because I realized I was giving power to the very thing I feared. By destroying myself, I was letting fear win. So I chose differently. I chose to survive, even if survival meant accepting an arrangement with a stranger. They looked at each other in the flickering lamplight, two people who had married to escape pain, only to discover they had married their mirror image. Boone felt something shifting inside him, some wall beginning to crack that he had believed was permanent. Calla must have seen it in his face because she moved closer, straddling his hips now, the thin fabric of her nightgown the only barrier between them. He froze again, his body responding in ways his mind had not prepared for. But she placed both hands flat against his chest, holding him still. "I am going to teach you something now. Something important." His voice came out rough. "What?" "How to accept care from another person without destroying it." She reached for the bowl of herbs again, scooping more of the mixture and spreading it across his shoulders, his collarbone, the places where tension had built into knots of muscle that never fully released. Her touch was firm but not aggressive, knowing but not invasive. She worked methodically, finding every point of pain and addressing it, and he found himself unable to maintain the distance that had kept him functional for 5 years. His breathing deepened. His eyes closed despite his resistance, and for the first time since Margaret, he allowed himself to feel something other than fear when a woman touched him. "This is not control," she said quietly, her hands moving in steady circles. "This is trust. You are letting me see you. You are letting me touch you. You are accepting that I have knowledge and choosing to believe I will not use it as a weapon. What if you do?" Her hands paused for a moment, then continued their work. "Then you will have learned that not everyone is Margaret. That risk is required for connection. That the alternative to being hurt is being alone forever. And eventually, loneliness becomes its own kind of death." Boone opened his eyes and looked up at her. She sat above him bathed in lamplight, her dark hair loose, her nightgown clinging to her frame. Her hands still working to ease pain he had carried so long, he thought it was permanent. And he realized with startling clarity that the woman he had married to protect himself from knowledge was teaching him the one lesson he needed most. That being known was not the same as being destroyed. The herbs had cooled on his skin, leaving behind a sensation that felt less like burning and more like awareness. Boone lay still beneath Calla's careful attention, watching her face as she worked, memorizing the way concentration pulled her eyebrows together slightly, the way her lips moved as if counting or measuring something invisible. She had moved from his chest to his arms, tracing old injuries he had forgotten were there, wounds that had healed on the outside but remained tender beneath the surface. Every touch felt like excavation, uncovering things he had buried deliberately. When she finished, she set the bowl aside and remained where she was, still straddling his hips, her weight a presence he no longer wanted to escape. The lamp flickered, sending shadows dancing across the walls, and in that unstable light everything felt both more and less real. He reached up slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted, and when she did not, he placed his scarred hands on her waist. The fabric of her nightgown was thin enough that he could feel her warmth beneath it, the rise and fall of her breathing, the subtle shift of muscle as she adjusted to his touch. "I do not know how to do this," he said quietly. "How to be married to someone who sees me." Calla placed her hands over his, her palms pressing his fingers more firmly against her sides. "No one knows at first. Marriage is not about knowing how. It is about choosing to try. What if I fail? What if I hurt you the way I have hurt myself?" Her expression softened, something gentle entering her eyes that had been guarded before. "Then I will tell you, and you will stop, and we will try differently. That is what partnership means. Not perfection, not safety, just the willingness to stay when things become difficult." Boone felt something loosening in his chest. Some knot he had tied so tightly he forgot it was there. His thumbs moved in small circles against her waist, an unconscious gesture of comfort or connection, or perhaps just the need to keep touching her now that he had started. She leaned forward, bringing her face closer to his, and he could see the scars on her forearm again where the sleeve had fallen back, reminders that she understood his darkness because she had walked through her own. "Tell me about your father. How did you take care of him for so long?" She was quiet for a moment, her eyes focusing on something past him, some memory that still held pain despite time's passage. He was a good man before the war. Strong, kind. He used to lift me onto his shoulders and carry me through town like I was the most important person alive. But the war changed him. He came back with wounds that no one could see, injuries that bled inside where no bandage could reach, like mine, like yours. He tried to drink them away, tried to work until exhaustion made him too tired to remember, tried everything except asking for help. And I watched him shrink, watched him become less every day until there was almost nothing left. When he finally died, I felt relief along with grief, and the guilt of that relief nearly destroyed me. Boone lifted one hand from her waist to her face, cupping her cheek the way she had done to him earlier. I am sorry you had to carry that alone. Tears gathered in her eyes but did not fall. She blinked them back with the control of someone who had learned to ration emotion carefully. I learned things during those 2 years. How to make mixtures that ease pain, how to recognize when someone is giving up, how to see past what people show you to what they are actually feeling. My father taught me medicine through his dying. He gave me knowledge I never wanted but now cannot unknow, and that knowledge is why you could read me so easily. She nodded. When I saw you at the altar with your shoulders pulled back too far, your jaw too tight, your hands hidden in your pockets, I knew. I knew you were a man at war with himself, and I thought perhaps I could help. Perhaps all the terrible things I learned watching my father destroy himself could be used to save someone else. Boone pulled her down gently until her forehead rested against his, their breath mingling in the small space between them. You did not come here just to escape debt. You came here to heal someone. Maybe. Or maybe I came here hoping that saving you would somehow save me too. They stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads pressed together, breathing in rhythm. Two damaged people choosing connection over safety. Then Boone spoke words he had not planned, words that felt like surrender and victory at the same time. Stay here tonight, not in the other room. Here, with me. Calla lifted her head to look at him directly, searching his face for certainty. Are you sure? No, but I am choosing it anyway. That is what you said, is it not? That marriage is about choosing to try even when you are uncertain? She smiled then, really smiled, and it transformed her face into something luminous. Yes, that is exactly what I said, and I choose to try too. Morning came through the window in shades of gold and amber, light that felt different from any sunrise Boone had witnessed in the 5 years he had lived in this house. He woke slowly, awareness returning in layers, first noticing warmth beside him, then the weight of an arm across his chest, then the reality that he was not alone. Calla lay curled against his side, her dark hair spread across his shoulder, her breathing deep and even with sleep. He remained perfectly still, afraid that movement would break whatever fragile thing had formed between them during the night. This connection built on shared wounds and chosen vulnerability. She stirred eventually, her eyes opening to find him already awake and watching her. For a moment, neither spoke, both adjusting to the strangeness of waking beside another person, of seeing morning light on a face that would now be part of every day forward. Then she smiled slightly, that same transformation he had witnessed the night before, and spoke in a voice still rough with sleep. Good morning, husband. Good morning, wife. The words felt different now, less like legal designation, and more like truth. Calla sat up slowly, the sheet falling to her waist, and Boone noticed that the guarded tension she had carried yesterday had eased. She looked more settled somehow, as if choosing to stay had given her something solid to stand on. She reached for his right hand, examining it in the morning light, running her fingers over the scars with familiar gentleness. These will heal better now, not because the injuries are gone, but because you will stop creating new ones. How can you be certain? Because you have a reason to keep your hands whole. You have someone who will notice if you hurt yourself, someone who will ask why, and that awareness changes everything. Boone considered this, recognizing the truth in it. The urge to punish himself had always been strongest in isolation, in the darkness of night when no one was watching and consequences felt distant. But now there was witness. Now there was Calla, who would see, who would know, who would not allow him to destroy himself quietly. What happens now? He asked. We cannot stay in bed forever. She laughed, a sound that felt like light entering a room that had been closed too long. No, we cannot. You have a ranch to run. I have a house to properly explore. We have a marriage to build beyond a single night of honesty. She rose from the bed and moved to the window, looking out at the land that stretched endlessly in all directions. Boone watched her standing there in her nightgown with morning sun illuminating her frame. and felt something he had thought was dead stirring back to life. Not the desperate need for control that had driven him to seek a virgin bride. Not the fear that had kept him isolated for 5 years. Something quieter. Something that felt almost like hope. Calla turned from the window and walked back to him, extending her hand. "Come, I want to see everything. The barn where you hurt your hands. The rooms you keep locked. The places you hide when the memories become too strong. I want to know all of it." Boone took her offered hand and let her pull him from the bed. They dressed in comfortable silence, the awkwardness of strangers sharing space already beginning to ease into something more natural. When they descended the stairs together, the house felt different, smaller somehow, less like a fortress, and more like a home that two people might actually live in. Outside, the morning air was cool and clean. Calla walked beside him toward the barn, her hand still in his, her steps confident on land she was only beginning to know. When they reached the support beam he had beaten bloody 5 nights ago, she stopped and placed her free hand against the wood, feeling the rough surface where his knuckles had left marks in the grain. "No more of this," she said quietly. "When the nights become difficult, you wake me. When the memories come, you speak them out loud. When the pain feels unbearable, you let me help carry it. That is the agreement we made, whether you realize it or not." Boone stared at the beam for a long moment, then released her hand. He walked to the tool wall and retrieved a heavy axe, the weight familiar in his grip. Calla watched without speaking as he returned to the support beam, positioned himself, and swung with all his strength. The blade bit deep into the wood, splintering the section where his blood had stained the grain dark. He swung again, and again, each strike removing the evidence of his self-destruction, each impact echoing through the barn like a declaration. When the damaged section lay in pieces on the ground, splinters and wood chips scattered across the dirt floor, he dropped the axe and turned to Calla. She was crying, tears running silently down her face, but she was smiling too. He crossed to her and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly while she pressed her face against his chest, her tears soaking into his shirt. They returned to the house hand in hand, and Boone led her directly to the kitchen. He crouched down and opened the lower cupboard where she had discovered the whiskey bottles the day before. 6 bottles lined up in a neat row, his solution to every difficult night for the past 5 years. He pulled them out one by one, setting them on the kitchen table while Calla watched in silence. The glass gleamed in the morning light streaming through the window, amber liquid that had dulled more pain than it had ever actually healed. He picked up the first bottle, held it for a moment as if weighing what it represented, then walked to the door and threw it hard against the rocks outside. The glass shattered with a sharp crack that echoed across the empty land. He returned for the second bottle, then the third. Calla joined him, taking bottles from the table and handing them to him one at a time, a silent partner in the destruction of his old methods of survival. When all 6 bottles lay in glittering pieces among the rocks, he stood looking at the wreckage, breathing hard, feeling lighter than he had in years. Inside again, they climbed the stairs together. At the top, Boone paused outside the first door. The room he had told Calla was hers. He pushed it open, and they stood in the doorway looking at the simple space. The bed with clean sheets, the dresser, the window facing east. The room felt empty despite the furniture, a placeholder for a marriage that was supposed to maintain distance and separation. "You do not have to sleep here," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yesterday I thought I wanted separate rooms because I thought isolation meant safety, but I was wrong. If you want your own space, I will respect that. But if you want to share mine, I want you to know that door will never be closed to you again. Not tonight. Not any night." Calla looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "What changed?" "Everything. You changed everything. You saw what I tried to hide and you did not run. You touched the parts of me I thought were too broken to heal. You chose to stay when you could have taken your bag and left at any point during the night. That kind of choice deserves honesty in return." She reached up and touched his jaw, her fingers gentle against the stubble there. "I choose to stay not just last night, but every night after. Your room. Our room. No more separation." He kissed her then, pulling her close, his hands tangling in her dark hair. It was not their first kiss. There had been hesitant touches the night before in the darkness, but this felt different. This was morning light and conscious choice, a kiss that sealed a decision rather than explored a possibility. When they finally separated, both breathing harder, he rested his forehead against hers. "I do not know how to be a good husband. I have no example to follow, but I want to learn. We will learn together. That is what partnership means. They spent the remainder of the morning working side by side. Boone showing Calla the full extent of the ranch, the corrals and sheds and equipment, explaining the work that needed doing, and asking her opinion on things he had always decided alone. She walked through it all with interest, asking questions that showed she was listening, offering thoughts that revealed she understood more about ranch life than he expected. When they returned to the house for the midday meal, she prepared food while he watched, and they ate together at the table talking about the future, with a comfort that felt earned rather than forced. That afternoon, Calla unpacked her single worn bag, but instead of placing her few belongings in the dresser of the first room, she carried them down the hall to his room, to their room, and arranged them alongside his things. Boone stood in the doorway watching her, seeing his solitary space transform into shared territory, and feeling no fear at the change, only relief that the isolation he had built so carefully was finally ending. As the sun moved toward the horizon, they stood together on the porch looking out at the land that stretched endlessly in all directions. Boone wrapped his arm around Calla's shoulders and she leaned into him, fitting against his side as if she had always belonged there. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we build a life, a real one, not based on fear or control or trying to protect ourselves from pain. Based on this, on choosing each other even when it is difficult, on waking each other when the nights are hard, on being known completely and trusting that knowledge will not be used as a weapon." Calla turned in his arms to face him. "That sounds like a good marriage. It sounds like the only kind worth having." Boone Slater had searched for a virgin bride believing innocence would protect him from betrayal. Instead, he found a woman who taught him that true protection came not from ignorance but from trust, not from distance but from intimacy, not from hiding, but from being fully known and choosing to stay anyway. The scars on his hands would heal better now. The whiskey bottles were destroyed. The beam in the barn was cut away, and the room that should have kept them separate stood empty while they built something real together. 24 hours after a ceremony neither had believed in, Boone and Calla began their actual marriage. Not the arrangement they had signed, but a partnership forged in vulnerability, honesty, and the courage to risk being hurt for the possibility of being truly loved. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and vulnerability collide in ways you never expected. Do not forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.